Defender fam, this is a Swad Walker Associate Editor. We are here with the one and only, the Reverend Dr. D.Z. Cofield, the pastor of Good Hope Missionary Baptist Church, and just a good brother. But you all already know that. How you doing, sir?
I'm doing great, man. I'm doing great. How you doing, brother?
I'm just fine. I'm just fine, and I'm looking forward to our conversation. Because we at the Defender, we've covered a lot of the protests of this potential TEA takeover of HISD. That's been on the minds and the lips of a lot of Houstonians. But then I get word that you are for the takeover, that you are cool with it. So I'm just curious as to why. But the way I want to have the conversation, if it's okay with you, is I'm going to bring up the different positions that people have shared in terms of why they are against the takeover, just to get your feel or your rebuttal to those.
Sure, no
positions.
problem.
Okay, all right. So the first thing I heard from the speakers at last week's protest was takeovers like this, takeovers of ISDs fail, whether it's in this city, that city, or the other. Takeovers fail. And so how do you respond if someone says that?
So first of all, let me start with the one of the fundamental problems is we're having protests outside of HISD headquarters. HISD has nothing to do with this. This is TEA all the way. The fact is HISD, the school board, has dropped the ball on the education of our children generationally. We're blaming House Bill 1842 that was introduced as bipartisan legislation by Harold Dutton and a Republican, and we're blaming Representative Dutton for the accountability tool that was basically created to help hold us accountable. Man, we had schools in the Houston Independent School District that have been failing 7 years. 5 years out of 7, 4 years out of 7. And the crazy part is when you talk about consecutive years, the problem is that when these schools fail, let's say they fail 3 years, 4 years, and then they have 1 year that they didn't fail, then they can fail another 4 years. I mean, because the law is not triggered. And so what was amazing to me is, even when Wheatley was failing, and Kashmir didn't have a certified math teacher in the building, period, for years. Didn't have a certified math teacher in the building. HISD did absolutely nothing. Now, when you talk about schools failing under TEA, fact of the matter is they were failing. That's why TEA had to come in. North Forest, for example, was failing. It was failing predominantly African-American leadership on the board. It was failing. Mike Williams grudgingly, commissioner of TEA at the time, grudgingly, after years of giving them opportunities to turn it around, ended up taking it over. And guess what? It was annexed by HISD. And HISD didn't do better by the children of North Forest. They did worse. As a matter of fact, the only school district that did better in North Forest was Yes Prep, North Forest. And they did better in part because they had 2 strong African-American leaders, 2 brothers who came in there, changed the culture, worked with the parents, and got the results in terms of raising the scores in their student outcomes. People are talking based on feelings, not facts. The fact of the matter is there's no school that, quote unquote, was doing well that TEA took over, and then it was doing worse after TEA. All of them were failing. All of them were failing for a variety of reasons. On my show, Real World, Real Talk, a caller called in and she wanted to talk about Lamarck. Lamarck was annexed by Texas City. It was a financial issue for Lamarck. They weren't handling their money. At the end of the day, TEA doesn't want to come in and take over anything. That's not what they want to do. And they gave us multiple opportunities over years to get it right. And the HISD school board didn't get it right. And there are reasons why they didn't get it right. There's some fundamental philosophical reasons why HISD never got it right.
So you talked about the history of schools failing in HISD. One of the refrains that I heard over and over at the protest was, "Why is TEA stepping in now?" There's been a dramatic turnaround. There's been, Wheatley was graded at an F, and now it's at a C. And so the constant refrain, like I said, was HISD is doing fine. Why is TEA doing this?
So here's the problem. If a C is doing fine for somebody, that should be a problem, because C is average. C is mediocre. Our children have genius within them. And the fact of the matter is, HISD wouldn't have made the changes they have made without the hammer over their head of House Bill 1842. They weren't making these changes before. There was no way to quantify the problems. I've talked to people who, for example, finished in the top 10% of their schools, and I'm talking about historically, in the historically Black schools, who went to colleges and universities and had to take remedial classes. Like, our children have continually been undereducated and virtually unemployable when they walk across the stage. And I come at this from a different perspective. I am an educator, but I also come out of the juvenile justice system. And so I've seen the miseducation of our children and the results of our children not being educated, because many of those who are on the board don't believe that our children have genius within them. And they're not committed to bringing that out of them, as we saw in many instances in our schools prior to desegregation, right? My father grew up behind a mule plowing in Lincoln, Alabama. And he gave me 3 rules, man, to live by. He said, 1, failure is not an option. That's not even a choice. You failing, you can't fail. Secondly, mediocrity is unacceptable. I brought a C home one time, and he looked at me, he said, "What is this?" I said, "It's a C." And I had a bunch of friends who were happy to pass. So, I walked in, "Hey, I got a C." And he said, "What does C stand for?" I said, I got a C. He said, "Look at the report card." And it said average. He said, "When did I have an average son?"
Wow.
He said, "I expect more from you than average." I was like, "Yes, sir." That was it, right? And then the third rule was, you got to be twice as good as white folk to make it in this world. Man, nobody's going to give you anything, right? And our bar is so low. It's so low. Here's what we're missing as well. When you look at the Children at Risk annual report of high schools, the 3 worst high schools in HISD weren't even the high schools that triggered House Bill 1842. They didn't even trigger House Bill 1842, right? And when you disaggregate the data, when you pull, for example, the magnet programs out of Sterling, Vanguard out of Jones, School of Communications out of Yates, when you disaggregate the data and you look at the local kids that are going there, man, our kids are doing horrible, and we're okay with that. And we can't settle for a C. But again, all of this came about. So when people say, why is the state stepping in now? Because House Bill 1842 was passed. And House Bill 1842 said, hey, man, you can't have a school failing 7 consecutive years. You can't do it, because you're doing a disservice to our children. And the problem is, with the HISD board, several things. One, well, let me say this. What I hope people will do is stop taking this takeover possibility as an indictment of their education or of a school's history, because that's emotional. So for example, you say, man, I went to Jack Yates. Just to say, my wife, my wife went to Jack Yates, right? And my wife is a proud Jack Yates alumnus. But she understands that the indictments being cast against Jack Yates, for example, in not educating our children properly, or failing multiple years, or Wheatley, whatever the school is, right? That's not speaking to where they were historically. That doesn't take away from the legacy of those schools. We're saying today our children are not being educated the way that other children in the district are being educated. And that is unacceptable. There needs to be equity, not just in funding, but in educating our children. And so for me, that is the bottom line. What's happening with our children? I don't want people to say, oh, they're attacking my education. No, they're not attacking your education. You got your education. We're talking about our children and our children's children and what needs to be done to make sure that they are adequately prepared to be successful in the world.
I'm really interested to hear your response to this, because that was another one of the consistent charges at the rally, that this attempted takeover or potential TEA takeover is not about students. It's not about education. Rather, it's about politics. It's about a power grab. More specifically, it's about a property grab. And there were a few people that mentioned the North Forest takeover and said there are properties that used to be school and they're now these thriving businesses. And so it was stated that this is a move to grab if you close a school, it destabilizes the community. It brings the property values down. Folk can come in and buy up real estate and do with it what they will. Usually folk that aren't from that community. So it's not about students and not about education. It's about something else. How do you respond to that?
So first, I would say the state doesn't have to come in order for that to happen. It's already happening. The Houston Independent School District is arguably one of the largest real estate brokers and facilitators of real estate development in our area. And it's been happening for years. We have seen literally bonds that voted to repair and renovate schools, and 2 bonds later, it was on the bond to tear those schools down in our community. So the question is, who's making money from the tear down? Who's making money from the rebuild? When somebody asked me about considering to run for the school board, I had a brother come to me and he said, now, Reverend, you know this school board is not about educating children. And I looked at him and I said, what? He said, school board is not about educating children. It's about contracts. That's what the school board is about. They're not concerned about educating children. They could care less. It's about contracts. It's about bids. It's about who gets a piece of the pie. So that's been going on. So you don't need the state to come in to do that. I asked Dr. Abe Saavedra when he was superintendent, they were tearing down a school in an area where at the time, Mayor Bill White had a program to build, I want to say 500 single family houses in this area. It was in the northeast section of our city, predominantly African-American, and they're coming in building these starter homes. That was his program. That was his vision. They went in, HISD went in and tore down the schools that were there. And so I asked the question because I'm on boards that were on both sides of the table. And I said, Dr. Saavedra, why would we tear down schools where the mayor is trying to build houses? Because one of the first things you look for are schools for young families. Right. And he said, well, they're not there now. And if they get there, we'll build a school later on to serve that population. So it was like, okay. And that's when I started asking questions. Somebody's making money from the tear downs. Somebody's making money from the buildings. But at the end of the day, that's already going on with HISD. That has nothing to do with the state. That's all local leadership and all local governance.
Thank you for that. And so another charge was the TEA takeover, attempt to take over HISD, is really about the voucherization and the charterization of HISD, so that it is no longer a quote unquote public school system in the traditional sense.
So I think one of the problems, let's be honest, many of the people who are articulating these positions don't send their children to their local schools if they live in the hood. Okay. These are people who have the means and affluence and exercise choice. So
Mm-hmm.
whether they are choosing to send their kids to a school that they are not district to because they're able to get them there, drive them there, or whatever the case may be, or they're able to move outside of a district or live outside of the city of Houston, as many of our community leaders do. They live outside of the city so they can send their kids to great schools. We're talking about people who don't have a choice or who don't know that they have a choice.
Mm-hmm.
So, when you speak to vouchers and charters, it's amazing because the propaganda of the district has blamed everybody else for their failure to educate our children. They blame charter schools. It's charter's fault. It's Yes Prep's fault. It's KIP's fault. It's, whoever the latest charter is that's coming in. Then it's the state's fault. And there's no ownership taken by the district. One of the benefits to the state coming in is that my understanding is that these representatives, this appointed board, will not be beholden to a specific special interest group or area. Right now, we have, I believe, very competent, able school board members to represent the interests of African-American children. Problem is they're outnumbered. They're outnumbered. And so even if they present something, you have this brown-black war that nobody wants to acknowledge is going on, right, between the Latino community, the Latinx community, against the African-American community, because they feel like they've been left out and haven't gotten to the table enough. You have the Anglo community, who has never been committed to educating the mass of African-American children. They have literally rejected the spirit, the tenets, and the principles of Brown versus the Board of Education. So they've never wanted to educate our children. And then you have 3 African-American board members who are sitting there trying to fight between these two juggernauts on each side of them. And we're outvoted. And so, it's no wonder that you have, for example, millions of dollars spent to expand a baseball field, for Bel Air, right? But you can't get quality educational material in the schools east of Main Street. There's a fundamental problem with that. And so, as the board comes in, as TEA comes in, this board will function as an at-large board. My understanding is, in reading the ruling, that they will come in, nobody is representing any one area. They look at all of the kids, and they're basically charged with bringing water into the dock and raising all of the boats, right? And getting all of the students at a level where their student outcomes are acceptable.
You talked about this potential TEA board coming in and not being beholden or not being accountable to special interests. One of the points raised at the rally was this board wouldn't be accountable to voters either. And that was a big concern from a couple of parents who spoke. They said, well, right now, my vote is my voice. There is a board member that I elected, and I can hold them accountable for what the board is or is not doing for the welfare of HISD students. So how do you respond when folks say, this takes power away from us, we the people?
I think in a real sense, it does. But that's because we haven't done our job. It's almost like, for me, it's likened to, hey, TEA is trying not to come in. They don't want to come in. They offered the leadership of the school district and development of a plan. They offered it to the mayor in the city of Houston. They turned it down. So the mayor said, no. City council members, no, we don't want to take it on. We're going to stay in our lane. None of the public officials stepped up with a plan. They wanted it. They wanted somebody in the community to take it. It was rejected because we had the dysfunction. You remember the dysfunction we had, man, on the board. You know what I mean? If folk having daisy chain meetings on the side and, thinking ethnically more than they're thinking academically, and we got to get a Latino in, we got to get, instead of looking at what's in the best interest of all of our kids, TEA said, hey, man, somebody come and take it. Nobody would. So at the end of the day, it's like, what's left? Because somebody has to take charge of the kids. And, I've had several dealings with Mike Morath, the commissioner of TEA. And that brother's all about the kids, man. I mean, he just, in every conversation I've had with him, in every meeting I've been in with him, every setting I've been in, he's about the kids. He doesn't even deal with black and white. Man, he's a white man that plays alpha. You know what I mean? So, he's just a different kind of dude, man. But he's all about the kids. And at the end of the day, I here's the problem for me when we talk about elected officials. Because our elected officials are outnumbered, it doesn't matter who you put in there. You know what I mean? You can put Marion Wright Edelman in there. You can put Frederick Douglass in there. You can put Booker T. Washington in there. They're outnumbered. They're only one vote. And they can't get anything passed when they're outnumbered 6-3. They just can't. And so, when you talk about losing your voice, I understand that. But when your voice, the voice that you have is not heard anyway, I don't know what we have to lose, because right now it's just, it looks like more than it really is. We just don't have any say in what's happening in our schools.
I want to come back at a later date and talk about the this black and brown war that no one's talking about. But my final question is really just asking for your prediction. And it is a two-part question. What is your prediction for this potential takeover? Do you think it's going to happen? Number two, if you believe it will, how do you think it's going to go? What can we do to change the realities of the student outcomes in HISD?
Yeah. So here's the question that I ask. Those who are against it, why are you against it? Okay. I understand why people west of Main Street are against it, because they like the system the way it is. Their kids benefit. Their schools benefit. Their schools are funded at a level, and whatever's lacking in their funding, they have the means to come up and step up and almost set up in a public platform a private school kind of culture. So I understand why they don't want it to change. I don't understand why those of us who represent people east of Main Street, why we don't want it to change, because we should want different results. We should want more for our children. What do I think is going to happen? I think TEA is going to take it over. I don't think they have a choice, because in a very real sense, the board still does not function with the best interest of all children in mind. We should not have boards that are divided around educating Latino children, but not white children or black children, not Asian children. That board should be together and united around educating all children. And it has never been that way. Point blank. It has just never been that way. And so because it has not been that way, somebody has to come in and hold us accountable to do that. Now, where do I think it's ultimately going to go? I think this state takeover is going to open up the door for a federal lawsuit eventually. And I think this is just the next step. I think if the state comes in and they fail with all of its resources, and they don't see marginal gains in terms of student outcomes and things like that, then I think the next step is going to be civil rights, lawsuit around just the education of our children, which, to be honest with you, is something that's going on around the country in terms of just the failure to really embrace the spirit and the tenets of Brown versus the Board of Education. Sadly, we're talking about from 1954, on up to the present. And there have been exceptions. There have been the talented 10th. There have been those who have been able to endure. and been able to survive and thrive despite that. But it has not been the case for the masses. And we know it hasn't been the case for the masses because we wouldn't talk so much about a school to prison pipeline, if it wasn't the masses of our people that were being, hurt by this.
There are those who look at this potential TEA takeover as something that is beyond HISD. You said it earlier that, the white community has never bought into or wanted to educate our children. And so they see this TEA takeover as just another example of this move to basically defund public education, to put the money into private schools, whatever, that are educating white children, but leaving Black and brown children behind. So how do you see that?
So I think when you look back at the passage of Brown versus the Board of Education and the weak attempt to implement its tenets in the 60s, because it didn't even start in the 50s, in the 60s, I do think that there are people who want choice.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact of the matter is, people of means do have a choice. You can choose to take your child out of a local school and drive your child to another school if you want to. Your child probably has a better opportunity to get into a Vanguard program or a magnet program. But all of those have been programs that were set up as an attempt to get around Brown versus the Board of Education. That's what our people don't understand. So, for example, magnet programs let the school control who comes into their magnet program. The school district control, you got to apply. And we determine how much coffee we want in our cream. We determine who's acceptable, who's not acceptable. Because we're going to interview the child, we're going to interview the parent and the family. We're going to look at where they live. All of that comes into a play, and it's about who adds value to our school. People of means historically have sent their kids. Bel Air was off limits, right? Bel Air was off limits. But if you were affluent historically in Houston and you were African-American, you were going to send your kids to Lanier. You were going to send your kids, first you were going to send your kids to River Oaks, if you can get in there, River Oaks Elementary. You were going to send your kids to Lanier, and you were going to send your kids to Lamar. If you had means, that's what you were going to do if you want to keep them in a public school setting. Mm-hmm. And to show you the historical nature of this racism, sometimes it's overt, sometimes it's covert. Take a school like Ryan Middle School versus Lanier Middle School, built around the same time period. Ryan Middle School, before it became this medical science magnet, was dilapidated, falling down, and HISD wanted to tear it down. They wanted to tear it down. The community came out, and many of the old-time Jack Yates alumnus said, no, you can't tear it down because this was the original Jack Yates High School. You can't tear it down. They wanted to tear it down. Why did they want to tear down Ryan and not tear down Lanier? Because Lanier is still standing, was maintained, capital improvements were made, and nothing was done at Ryan. As a matter of fact, it was so funny. Oswald, your readers may find this interesting. When they talked about tearing it down, Dr. Saavedra said, well, I'm going to go and inspect the school, right? And I'm going to see what's going on, because they're claiming that the school has been neglected. They put crews on from HISD, construction and maintenance.
No.
24 hours, round the clock. When Saavedra got there several days later, he's walking around and he says, man, this school looks great. And he leans up against the doorpost, looking in, the door jamb, looking in to one of the classrooms and says, I don't see what the problem is here. And his whole arm was covered with paint. Now, I had been in the school 2 months earlier. Man, there was holes in the floor. There were sections you couldn't even walk in. They had yellow tape around there, and our kids were in there, right? At the end of the day, here's what I've discovered. People don't do right until they're made to do right. Most folk don't have the character to do right just because it's the right thing to do. And when it comes to the education of our children, HISD as a board is not committing to doing right by our children unless they are made to do right. Mr. Millard House, superintendent, I had an opportunity to interview him, and he made a statement and put it out in writing. I'm sure you all have the quote where he said, it's going to take courage. It's going to take innovative thinking to turn this around. And I don't doubt that the brother knows what to do. I don't think he has a board that's courageous enough. I don't think he has a board that's courageous enough, that's willing to make decisions that may not benefit their area, but will benefit all of our children. See, at the end of the day, man, people at Bel Air, they saw no way that the outcomes at Wheatley and Cashmere and Sterling, they saw no way that their outcomes were going to affect what they do.
Right.
So they were cool with the way things were. They're like, hey, man, we good. We don't care about them folk over there, man. We don't care about them. 1842 said, no, as a school board, you're not just responsible as a representative for your area. You are responsible for all of the children in the school district. There was a move several years ago to divide the school district. And the dividing line, interestingly enough, was Main Street, right? It was kind of like everybody west of Main Street, they're going to form their own school district, and everybody east of Main Street, they're going to be their own school district. And that's going to settle it. We're going to make everything smaller. And the courts rejected that, surprisingly enough. In the state of Texas, the courts rejected that and said, no, it would place undue pressure and unfair strain on those schools east of Main Street. You can't separate. And so, at the end of the day, the school district and the school board has never figured out how to put aside their egos and come together for the benefit of all children. Clearly we need somebody from the outside to come in and say, it's got to change. Know why they don't want it to change. I'm still trying to figure out why we don't want it to change, because, C for me is not satisfactory, man. When we have students who have A and B potential in them, they have genius in them. It's our fault if we're not educating them, and we have to stand for them and help them.